Hello and welcome to this Astranti strategic analysis video for the May and August strategic case study exam on airport owner-operator Arrfield. In this video we're going to be looking at some of the different parts, different components of the CIMA strategic syllabus and how they relate back to the company. We'll start by looking at the company itself, the case that we are analysing for the strategic case study. And it's based around the airport operating industry, and that is what Arrfield is. It's a large, very large publicly traded organisation based in Norland. It's the largest airport owner-operator in Norland by quite a sizable margin. The closest competitor is only a third of the size of Arrfield. So it's a very big, very powerful organisation. Now, it's quite a complex industry, and it's one that few people will perhaps be familiar with. Now, I'm sure you've all used an airport, you've all been to an airport, taken a flight from an airport, maybe even worked at an airport. But the actual logistics behind it, the amount of things that they actually have to do, the amount of things that have to come together is quite substantial. So it's a very interesting case for us to analyse. And how we're going to look at it in this particular video is using the rational model. So ultimately looking at where the organisation currently is, its current position, where it ultimately wants to be, and the strategy that it is going to use to get from the now to the future. And there are various different components of each of these three overarching categories as well. So for starters, when we're looking at the future, we're going to be looking at the mission of the organisation, what it wants to achieve, what its purpose is, looking at their performance measurement, how they can check that they're on track for actually achieving their goals, the governance within Arrfield, the governance within the organisation, the ethics and corporate social responsibility of the company, the factors that are crucial to the success of it, and also the various different stakeholders of the company. There are quite a few stakeholders of Arrfield. We'll then look at where the company currently is using the external analysis tool Pestle to look at the greater environments in which Arrfield operates before looking more closely at the actual industry in which it operates in using Porter's 5 forces and summarising the position of the organisation in a SWOT analysis. And then once we have defined where the company wants to be and where it currently is, we'll look at how it's going to get there using various different strategy models such as generic strategies and Ansof's matrix before looking at the ways in which the company can grow in the future and ultimately the strategies that it will need to have in place to get to that future position, that future state of affairs. So quite a few different things to go through, but it's my hope that by the end of this video you have a really good idea of the mission of the company and the forces affecting the company and the strategies that it could undertake in order to become a more successful organization in the future. And we're going to start by looking at where the organisation is heading, looking at the actual end point, because it's better to look at where it wants to be so then we can build up to that throughout the rest of the rational model. So we'll start by looking at the mission of the company, what it ultimately wants to achieve, what the purpose of the organization is. And this is very important that this is defined because it gives everyone in the organization, all the various different stakeholders, an idea about what the company is about, and it gives them something to work towards. And we're going to break down the mission statement of Arrfield using what's known as Campbell's mission statement. And these are the various different components of a good mission statement. There is the purpose. This is why the organization exists. Who does it exist for? And what is it ultimately trying to achieve? So for a company to have an effective mission statement that provides a common purpose, it should set the scene, should set the tone, what the organization is actually there for. If it doesn't say why the organization exists, then there is no purpose for it. And that makes it harder for everyone to work together for you to achieve goal congruency. But also talk about the strategy. So how is the organization going to compete? What kinds of business areas does it operate in, the industries that it operates in, and also how it actually competes as well. Does it compete by being better than everyone else? Does it compete by being different than everyone else? Does it compete by being cheaper than everyone else, etc.? Then the values of the company, what does it stand for? Does it stand for good quality? Does it stand for being innovative? Does it stand for caring for its stakeholders, for providing value for money as well? So you might see that in your mission statement. You might also see in the core values of the company as well. And finally, the policies. Now, these generally don't feed through into the mission statement, into the value statements quite as much, but these are basically codes that are in place, are in practice at the organization to ensure that all the different stakeholders and the staff, etc., are all aware of the purpose of the organization, the strategy, the values of the organization, so they can work towards it. So purpose, strategies, and values essentially are what should be in the mission and the value statement, and then the policies are the things that are in place to ensure that everyone working within the organization acts according to those values, strategy, and purpose. So let's take a look at the mission statement of Arrfield. Now, Arrfield's mission is to create sustainable growth in shareholder wealth while respecting the needs of other stakeholders, particularly the staff, passengers, customers, and communities who live and work alongside us. So let's take a look at that. Let's break that down. Is there a purpose there? Is there a real purpose of the company? Why does it exist? What does it hope to achieve long term? Well, it mentioned that it wants to create sustainable growth. So that could be what it's ultimately trying to achieve. It's trying to grow, but not just in a way that can be utilized here and now, but in a way that is sustainable for the future, so it can consistently grow in the future. But it ultimately doesn't necessarily say what the purpose of the organization is. The purpose is to create growth, is to create sustainable growth in shareholder wealth. Is that a real purpose? That's perhaps talking specifically to the stakeholders of the organization. It exists to provide sustainable growth for the shareholders, but it doesn't actually mention anything about it being an airport company, for starters. It doesn't mention anything about how it attempts to operate in a way that respects the needs of the various different stakeholders, such as staff, passengers, etc. So the purpose of the organization is left a little bit unclear by the mission statement. Same with the strategy. It doesn't talk about the airport industry. It doesn't talk about how it's going to actually compete either. It just says that it's going to create sustainable growth. It doesn't say that it's going to compete by being the best, etc. But it does say that in the vision statement, where it says it wants to be the world's best airport company. But that in turn does not actually talk about what the organization stands for. If we look at the values part of the Campbell's mission statement, it doesn't talk about how it's actually going to provide this service. It doesn't talk about what it actually respects, what it actually stands for in terms of quality, innovation, etc. It just says to be the world's best airport company and to create sustainable growth while respecting the needs of other stakeholders. So I suppose it does show that the organization does stand for its stakeholders. It does respect the needs of those, respect itself being quite a vague word. But if we do look at the core values of the company itself in the value statement, it does start to talk a bit more about what the organization stands for. So it talks about safety and security for staff. So it respects the needs of those staff, those passengers, the customers, the staff of those customers, etc., by offering them a safe and secure environment. Also stands for keeping its promises as well. So all of its financial and brand promises it keeps, or attempts to keep at least, and they commit to delivering on those promises. And also that they want to be a very innovative company as well. It talks about they are always learning. That's one of the value statements. So when you're talking about how they're going to measure performance, when we're talking about the learning and the growth part of the performance matrix, we can talk about technology, innovation, how many innovations has it put in to improve airport operations. And also, one of the big values that came out of the value statement as well was this idea of we can do that. So it's all about staff being empowered to deal with problems. It's all about everyone being on board with delivering to the various different customers, to the passengers, etc. If they need something, we can do that. We find a way of doing that if it's not immediately apparent how we do that. So ultimately, across the vision, the mission, and the value statements of this company, a lot of these parts are fulfilled, but it doesn't talk about them specifically in the mission statement to perhaps quite the same extent as some mission statements do. But a mission statement does need to be quite broad, so it doesn't have to be very, very specific. But the fact that it doesn't really mention about what the company is about, it doesn't mention why it exists, it doesn't even mention the fact that it is an airport company other than in the vision statement, perhaps would make it somewhat harder to provide that common purpose that is so important in a mission statement. Because at the moment, if you're reading that mission statement, if you're an employee working at Arrfield, your mission is to create growth for shareholders without really saying where you would create growth or how you create sustainable growth as well. And also, there's no mention in the value statements as well about the communities that live and work alongside us. So airports, of course, create a lot of noise, create a lot of pollution. It's got a real impact on the communities that live around the airports, and there was no mention of them either. And that's actually very important because that's a really key issue in the real world airport industry. And so that is something that is very likely to come up in your exam, or there's likely to be some questions based on that in some of the variants. And also what you want to do when you're going through these value statements, when you're going through the mission statement, etc., is if you are asked a question in the exam about perhaps a new project, maybe is expanding an airport or building a new runway and all these sorts of things you have to argue to and against it or for and against it, is think of these values, think of some of the things that the organization does as almost a checklist to whether or not this is a suitable, acceptable expansion. Because if it is financially viable, if it makes sense from a financial perspective, that's fair enough. But just because it makes sense financially doesn't automatically mean that it is something that we should do if it doesn't tie in with our values. Yes, it's going to make us money, but is it going to compromise our commitments to our other stakeholders? Is it going to set us back in terms of providing a safe and secure environment? If so, then perhaps it's not something we should be doing, even if it is financially viable. So that's what the organization is ultimately trying to achieve. That's its common purpose. But how would it measure whether or not it is achieving it or not? Well, one of the things you can use here, one of the key models from the CIMA syllabus that is used for performance measurement, is the balanced scorecard. And the balanced scorecard is great because it moves away from pure financials into more fields about being able to measure whether you are improving or not, whether you are growing, etc. So let's take a look at some of the perspectives. And we've got the financial perspective, which of course makes sense, as in that's just about the finances. Are you generating a return? Are you profitable, etc.? What's the level of debt running through the company, etc.? Then there's the learning perspective. This is to do with innovation. This is to do with growth, how much you are improving. Internal perspective is to do with the internal efficiency, how effectively are staff utilized, are you performing to budget, how many tasks are completed on time, etc. And finally, the customer perspective. So how satisfied your various different customers are with the service you are providing. So for finances, that's generally quite straightforward. The cash flow of the organization does have enough cash on hand to pay its debts as and when they fall due. Are the shareholders getting a substantial return on their investment? Are you measuring that? And also the profit of the organization, how much money you're reinvesting in the company. From a learning perspective, we can think about the number of new projects that are completed, the number of new contracts that we have with our various different customers, be that the airlines or the concession stands, etc., all the various different third parties that work with us, the number of new innovations and new technologies that we implement as well. Remember that one of the values was about being innovative, being at the forefront of innovations to make it a more safer, more secure, more innovative environment for everyone to work. So think about biometric scanners to help with security, but also to improve the efficiency of the airport. And some of these biometric scanners that they're developing are essentially, where the bag goes through at the airport. You put the bag on the conveyor belt, it goes in, it scans the bag, and it shows whether there's any weapons or drugs or anything like that in the bag. Well, these biometric scanners are, in a sense, quite similar to that, but for people. So rather than having to sort of line up and take your shoes off and go through the metal detector and then get patted down, or if something sets off the metal detector, you then get the person going over you with the handheld one, etc., which is very time consuming. These biometric scanners are essentially where you just walk through and it will just scan you like it scans the bag. So they can see immediately, just as you're carrying on walking through, whether there's anything that they need to pull you aside for. And if that were to be implemented effectively, then ultimately it would speed up the whole security process, because people can just carry on walking through and they can just be pulled out as and when there is something that they need to check for, rather than everyone having to go through the same stop, start, wait, okay, come through, take your shoes off, all that sort of thing. So that would improve the safety and security, because it's far more accurate than just having a metal detector or something like that. But it would also allow for a more efficient flow of passengers through security. Then with the internal perspective, think about how effective the security is, how effective employees are at being utilized, how much downtime there is, etc. When, of course, that's not good for the actual cost of the business if people are standing around doing nothing. The success rates of every project and everything that the company embarks on, and also the satisfaction and the health and safety record of the company as well. That's very important to the internal operations. And then the customer perspective is fairly straightforward. The number of customers that the company has, be they third parties, concessions, airlines, outsourced companies, all the people that the organization work with, the number of passengers, and the satisfaction of these various different stakeholders. So that being the third parties, the key strategic partners, also the passengers as well. And the length of contracts and the number of contracts that are renewed as well will be a good indicator of that. If we've got a major retail chain or a restaurant chain that has a contract with us in our airports and they decide they don't want to renew that contract, then that should be an indicator that they are not satisfied with the service that we've provided. They're not satisfied with what they have got out of being involved with our company. Perhaps they feel the level of commission is too high and it's thus not profitable enough to operate in the airport, etc. So when you are thinking about the company's performance, don't just think about the fact that, oh, it had more profit this year. There was a 14% increase in net profit, so everything's good. We don't have to worry about anything else. Do think about these other perspectives as well, as they are important. Then on to the governance of the company. We're just going to look at what good governance includes before we move on to some specific governance things relating to the actual organization. So this is based on the UK Code of Governance. These are some of the key things about the UK Code of Governance. And in the CIMA exams, any kind of code of governance is usually based off the UK Code of Governance. So if there was a code of governance for Nordland, it would be called the Nordland Code of Governance, but it would basically be the UK code. But there was no actual mention of any codes in the specific pre-scene. Now, good governance is all about running an organization in a way that is effective and efficient and fulfills the needs of the various different stakeholders. You're not just focusing on the needs of the shareholders, and you're certainly not focusing on the needs of the directors. because the directors are ultimately running the company on behalf of the owners. They themselves do not own the company for a public organization. That's why governance is very useful, particularly if it's a public company. But even then, there's good information, there's good insights in how to run a company effectively. So for good governance, you should have a separate chairperson and a CEO. Chairperson is the head of the board, the CEO is the head of the company. If you have the same person operating and occupying both positions, then there is a potential conflict there because you have the same person running the board who is also running the company. You should have independent non-executive directors, and they should be in a similar balance to the executive directors, and their role is to act as a controlled system to check what the executive directors are doing to make sure that they are doing everything above board, everything is in the best interests of the company itself. Should have the audit, nomination and remuneration committees. The audit committee ultimately there to set the tone for risk management and audit. Nomination committee there to ensure the right people with the right skills are appointed to the board and that they are paid fairly and that those pays are disclosed as well, because it can be quite controversial if the directors are in charge of their own pay and they're paying themselves hugely inflated salaries at a time when the rest of the country is struggling or the actual company is struggling as well, particularly if the company is struggling and has had to make people redundant. You've had 1,000 people who were being paid £20,000 a year have been laid off because of costs, and the company needs to cut costs. They've had to make all these people redundant, and yet the directors of the company have given themselves a £10 million pay rise. Well, that £10 million would have gone a long, long way to keeping all those people in jobs, particularly if they are £20,000, earning £20,000, and there's 1,000 of them, then actually what you could have ultimately done there is just not paid such a huge bonus to the directors and paid those staff a decent wage. So that's often something that you must be aware of, particularly because it can reflect on the company, particularly if they are going through tough times, given that they have to publish it and the public are generally very aware of these sorts of things. Also, you need to have a risk management focus as well. This ties in with the audit committee, and there also might be a risk committee, and ultimately they're there to ensure that risks are being managed throughout the organization and that the directors have the right information about the risks, about the finances, etc., to make sure they are making effective decisions. And on the subject of decisions, all directors must be involved, all executive directors and all non-executive directors. You shouldn't have one person that's holding too much power. That's the whole point of governance. One of the reasons why governance was brought in was because lots of companies were going through scandals where one person had so much power and they were making all kinds of decisions that were bad for the company, but they were walking away with millions and millions of pounds in bonuses, etc. And also, you should have regular meetings with your institutional shareholders, your major shareholders, and then also all the shareholders should have an opportunity to meet in the annual general meeting. So that's some of the principles of good governance. Let's take a look at it applied specifically to Arrfield. There is the potential for the agency problem here. We are a publicly traded organization and we have various different shareholders. There's no mention of the specific shareholders though. And we are run by the directors. So the agency problem basically exists where the directors are running it and they're running it on behalf of the owners. Now, they may make decisions that are not in the interest of the owners, but are in the interest of themselves, and that is what is known as the agency problem, because they have the decision-making power, not the owners. So particularly if the directors have got certain things in their contract, where if they increase profits by a certain percentage or dividends by a certain percentage, they get a big bonus. They might leverage the long-term sustainability of the company just to get that very much short-term growth up so they can get their bonuses, go off and run a different company instead. And so that's particularly relevant here, and also particularly given that our mission here at Arrfield is for sustainable growth. Doesn't have any mention in the pre-scene so far about it being a requirement in Nordland. Often if it is a requirement, it will say that companies in Nordland are expected to comply with the Nordland Code of Governance, etc. So we don't know for sure whether they are expected to comply with the Code of Governance or not. But as I already mentioned, it's always good to do it. even if there is no requirement, because ultimately it's about running an organization in a way that is best for all stakeholders. So even if it's not a requirement, even if you weren't a public company, there are still lessons to be learnt from governance. They do have a balanced number of non-executive directors and chairperson as well, and this is useful for bringing that wider experience to the board, checking the decisions as well. There's a good mix of non-executive directors and executive directors. It's half and half, whereas often sometimes you'll have one non-executive director or two against 6 or 7 executive directors, and that is not a good balance. You want to have enough non-executive directors to bring experience and control to the board. Didn't also mention though how things were audited within the company. There was no mention of any internal audit charters, and also where the relationship with the external auditor comes in. That was not mentioned in the case. Of course, the external auditor, very important in the real world. Think of your PwCs, your KPMGs, etc. They are there to check the statements so that the owners of the company, the shareholders, can rely on the statements. They do have all the committees, including the risk committee, though. The risk committee often comprised of people across the organization, and their job there is to identify and put controls in place to manage risks. The audit committee and the audit department then responsible for checking the controls, and that's an important distinction. Sometimes students often confuse risk and audit. They are two different things. Risk is about finding risks that are affecting the organization, putting effective controls in place. The audit committee is there to check the controls are effective and being adhered to. It's not the role of audit to actually identify the risks themselves. They're there to check the controls that have been put in place. The chair does sit on all the committees, as we saw in the pre-scene. Now, there's nothing wrong with that as such, but the chair should generally not chair any of the committees, because the committees themselves will have a chair, and the chair of the company can be a member of the committees but shouldn't chair the committees as well. And also there was no talk of where they get their information from or the meetings that are held, and that of course is an important part of governance. That would be a weakness in their governance if they didn't have decent systems in place to ensure that directors have all the right information to make the decisions together, and also if there is no annual general meeting. These are things that they should be having as a public company. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and more importantly, you have found it useful. Just going to take a moment to tell you about the courses that we produce here at Astranti for our case studies. And all of the products that you see here are available as standard as part of the course, but they are also available for purchase individually. We have the Exam Technique series, which is a study text and a video series, which looks at how to plan your answers, how to read the material and analyze the material effectively, and to manage your time effectively in the exam, which is incredibly important. Most people who fail the case study exam fail it because of poor exam technique. So that's a really important video series for you to watch to ensure that you've got that technique. There is a specific technique to sitting the case study exam, and all will be revealed in that video series. And do head over to the website for more information about it. We then have our theory revision series, which again is a study text and a video series, and that looks at the specific theories that are relevant to the case study, because a lot of the material from the E's, the P's, the F's won't appear in the case study. It's only specific topics that are frequently tested in the case study. So to save you from revising all the E's and all the F's and all the P's, we've created a more condensed revision series to refresh yourself of the knowledge that you'll need for the exam. We then have our pre-scene analysis series, which looks through the pre-scene page by page, bringing out the important points. In addition to that video series, there is also a video that looks at the top 10 most likely unseen issues, and also the strategic analysis video, which takes all the key models from the CIMA syllabus and applies them to the case. We then have our industry analysis pack, which is a large document that looks at the industry that the pre-seen is based on, looks at all the real companies that are actually operating in that actual industry in the real world, looks at how they market, what the suppliers are, what the key stakeholders are, how they operate, industry trends, and also a series of industry examples that you can use and reference in your exam. And we've got sample paragraphs to show you how you would use it in the exam, and that's a document. There's also an accompanying video with it. We have our mock exams, which are based on actual exams, but they feature the reference to the actual case, so they're on the actual case that you will sit the exam on. We've done our best to make them as close to the actual exams as possible, and you can actually sit those online in an online system that replicates the one that you'll use on the exam day, so you can really test yourself under exam conditions. And we provide marking and feedback for those mocks as well, where you'll get a tutor that will analyze your script and will give you a comprehensive document providing you with information not only on your actual script, as in whether you passed and failed and what you should have brought up and what you shouldn't have brought up, etc., but will also give you an appraisal on your technique as well, how to improve your exam technique. We then have our question packs, which is a series of shorter mock style questions based around the core activities. So if you find that you really struggle with certain parts of the CIMA syllabus, that will be a really good way for helping you. For example, if it's the core activity A's that you're always struggling with, or the B's that you're struggling with, you can look at the specific core activity A pack, which will give you questions based on those subjects. And then we have our masterclasses. We have 2 live all-day masterclasses, one at the start of the course and one at the end of the course. The one at the start of the course will give you all sorts of hints and tips on how to plan, how to use your time effectively. We'll also go through the planning process live, which will be really helpful for you as you progress into your mock exams. And then we have the revision masterclass right at the end, which looks at everything you've covered, gives you a refresher on everything you've covered over the 6-week period. And that's going to be really useful for giving you those little extra hints and tips to get you the extra marks in the exam. So do head over to the website www.astranti.com for more information about those. And I hope to see you again for the next video.